Hello, my name is Dahlia Fisher. I'm Director of External Relations for the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage. On behalf of everyone at the museum, welcome to our virtual launch event for Stories of Survival, Object, Image, Memory, featuring the co-creators, curator Arielle Weininger, and documentarian photographer Jim Lommasson, joining us in Cleveland, Ohio from their home bases of Chicago, Illinois, and Portland, Oregon. How incredible is it that we can connect from around the corner and across the globe to celebrate with our second ever virtual opening event. We would like to thank our sponsors who supported bringing this important first of its kind exhibition to Cleveland. Thank you to our presenting sponsor and museum co-founders, Milton and Tamara Maltz. Our signature sponsor, John P. Murphy Foundation. Benefactor sponsors, the Cleveland Armenian Community, the Fernanda and Joseph Friedman Holocaust Education Fund by Bruce and Rita Mandel, David and Inez Myers Foundation. To our patron sponsors, the Schwabel Family Foundation, Marianne and Gary Seamus, Ursuline College, Margaret Wong and Associates, and Dan and Ellen Zellman. Thank you to our contributing sponsors, Harry J. and Rosalind Abraham and family, Norma Siegeller, the Klein Family Foundation, Cole Israel Foundation, Lori and Steve Potash, Mary Ann and Dan Rothstein, the Nathan and Fanny Shaffron Foundation, Zahava and Warren Sklar, Shani and Scott Spiegel, Julie and Michael Freeman, Marsha Wexberg, and Ken Singer, and the Catholic Diocese of Cleveland. Thank you for leading us here tonight, for giving us a space and platform to discuss and discover stories of survival. This landmark exhibit showcases more than 60 never before seen personal items brought to America by survivors of the Holocaust and genocide. These objects and memories start from very different origins, from Germany to Belgium to Armenia to Syria, yet common threads bind them together. These are the threads that bind us all. They are the commonality of an immigrant experience, an American experience. The exhibit, the launch event, none of it would be possible without the generosity of our incredible Cleveland community. Thank you to the museum's many community partners, from universities and colleges to media, arts, and cultural organizations, to social justice institutions and diversity and inclusion advocates. It takes all of us to build a better world and raise our voices together so that we can be heard. When we began our outreach to the community for support and partnership, one of the first calls was to our longtime friend and a leader in the Armenian community, Ara Bagdasaryan. During World War I, 1.5 million Armenians were systematically mass murdered in a genocide that preceded the Holocaust. On September 1st, 1939, as Nazi troops prepared to invade Poland, signaling the start of World War II, Adolf Hitler reportedly said, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Let me say now that we do. Our shared passion for Holocaust education and genocide remembrance is a united promise to never forget. Please welcome to the screen tonight's moderator, Ara Bagdasaryan.
Thank you, Dahlia. I am honored to be here. As a member of the Armenian community and a longtime partner of the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage, we share a deep historical bond of survival and resilience with the Jewish community, which is exemplified in this powerful exhibit. It was not until the 1940s that the word genocide came to exist. A Polish-born Jew named Raphael Lemkin immigrated to the United States, escaping Nazi persecution, and then learning of the atrocities against the Armenians during World War I and the horrors of losing his own family in World War II. He combined genus, the Greek word for race or tribe, with side, the Latin suffix for killing. Lemkin then dedicated his life to making genocide an internationally recognized crime defined as acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Through this exhibition, Stories of Survival, Object, Image, Memory, organized by the Illinois Holocaust and Education Center, we join together to remember victims and survivors of the Holocaust and genocide. This exhibit is especially meaningful to me and my family as the grandson of survivors who witnessed unspeakable cruelty of the genocide firsthand. Tonight, we will meet the exhibition creators, curator Arielle, Weininger, and documentarian photographer Jim Lommasson. Arielle Weininger is the chief curator of collections and exhibits at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, where she leads the curatorial and custodial responsibilities for the museum's collection of over 30,000 historical objects and artworks. She holds an MA in Near East and Middle Eastern Studies from the University of London, a BA in Art History and Photography from the University of Iowa, and she is a highly regarded museum professional with over 20 years of museum experience. Jim Lommasson is an award-winning freelance photographer, teacher, and author living in Portland, Oregon, I should say, specializing in ongoing collaborative storytelling projects exhibited at many noteworthy venues, including the Ellis Island National Museum of Immigration. After we hear from Arielle and Jim, I'll be back to moderate a question and answer session. Please join me in welcoming to the virtual stage, Arielle and Jim.
Thank you so much, Ara. Jim and I are so honored to be here, and thank you to the Maltz Museum and your community for having us, for having our exhibition. And in a few moments, Jim and I are going to go through the exhibition with you, a sort of an overview. I am going to share my screen. So, Stories of Survival, Object, Image, Memory is an exploration of the meaning behind everyday things that become so much more. The exhibition allows us not only to explore the past, but to connect it to today and to the common experiences of displacement, immigration, and starting over in a new land, while still holding on to memories, values, and customs from a previous home. It stirs in people questions about what they would bring with them and why it's important. These stories remind us of our commonalities, regardless of language, faith, or the generations we can trace back in America. Prior to the exhibition's creation, the Illinois Holocaust Museum hosted photographer Jim Lommasson's exhibition, What We Carried, Stories by Iraqi Refugees, which looked at the refugee experience through the few keepsakes that they brought with them to America. Over a decade ago, Lommasson began working on this collaborative photographic and writing project with the Iraqi and Syrian refugee communities in the United States, based on objects they brought with them to this country. And I'm going to pause and I'll let Jim talk about this work a little bit.
Great, thank you, Arielle, and thank you to the Maltz Museum. I love the fact that this work is being seen by so many people now, and it gives me hope to know that so many people will see these photographs and the writing of the participants and take something away from these stories. This is a plate that Susan Barwari from Iraq brought with her to America. And when she was leaving her beautiful home in Baghdad, knowing that there was danger right around the corner, she had to decide what she would take with her. And so this plate that her family used for generations to use at celebrations and holidays, she wrapped the plate and some teacups in her clothes, in her baggage that she took from Baghdad to Syria and then to Chicago. And she writes about how, this plate reminds her of her mother and every event that her family experienced together and all the joy living in Iraq. And, one thing as you look at the photographs in the exhibition, one of the things that I hope the viewer takes from this experience is just hearing the stories from everybody in this exhibit. There's 60 pieces. But I hope that at a certain point, you start to think about, if you had to leave tonight under the cover of darkness and maybe with a child under each arm, what would you take? And the next question I hope comes to mind is, what might you be leaving behind? And that's really everything else. That's your home, your family, your language, your culture, and your history. And you're leaving to a new land. And so that's part of what I hope creates empathy and compassion by the viewers. And so this is just one. And Arielle?
What struck the museum staff, specifically, I think myself in conversation with Jim and our CEO, Susan Abrams, was the deep similarities between the Iraqis' objects and the museum's collection, comprised of the very few items Holocaust survivors were able to bring with them to their new homes in the US. A family photo, an identity card, a teddy bear. The museum saw an opportunity to tell a different yet similar story, one of Holocaust survivors, their connections to the past and how they overcame hardship, as well as the stories of other genocide-affected communities and how they relate to their few objects from home. The exhibition allows the viewer to walk in someone else's shoes and experience through their eyes the effort to hold on to cherished memories while adapting to new circumstances. These objects reflect the lives of their one-time owners, childhood, home, culture, and religious practice, but also the impact of war, trauma, displacement, exile, and migration. They have survived the Holocaust, genocides, and conflicts in Armenia, Bosnia, Cambodia, Iraq, Rwanda, South Sudan, and Syria. A snap decision or a stroke of luck resulted in what remains from a lost world. Dislodged from their original surroundings, these seemingly ordinary objects are now storytellers. They represent futures that were forever altered. And again, I'm going to toss it over to Jim.
And Syrian, as they fled their home, hid some money in the boards under the floor. And they also included this urn. And so as they fled their home and then eventually came back, they found that the money had been taken from their home, but under the floorboards, this urn was still there. And she wrote, "This Khmer copper urn is a gift from my great-grandparents who had kept it for generations. It is the souvenir I love most because my great-grandparents gave it to me before they passed away."
For this exhibition, multiple victims and survivor groups and their descendants were asked to participate. Lommasson photographed these items on a plain white background. Participants were then asked to engage with the photographs and express themselves however they felt comfortable, directly on the print. Writings and creative expressions on the images attach memories to the objects. Autobiographical narratives become collective history. These stories of survival, resulting from incomprehensible inhumanity, represent shared experiences despite the differences of time and place. Experiences of resilience, courage, the fragility of life, family history, and hope for the future. Jim?
Yeah, there were several objects that affected me the most, and this letter is one of them. And what it is it's a letter from the family who were able to flee back to their family in Syria, and they wanted to know how the family have been doing, if they survived. And so that's the main writing on the letter. And then the diagonal writing on the lower right corner is the postmaster writing back saying, "I'm sorry to be the one that tells you this, but your entire family were murdered by the Nazis." And then the writing around the letter are written by the Chicago family. And so for me, this, 3 layers of storytelling, of writing, of this horrible story, are all on one photograph. And the photograph becomes its own object. I'm going to read you just a little bit about what's written on the lower right of the background. "My dad fasted on March 6th every year for as long as I can remember. That was the date in 1942 that his family, along with other Jewish people in his hometown of Syria, were killed by the Nazis. There are 2 lessons to be learned from his history, or from the story. The first is, as often is the case with stories from the Holocaust, is to never forget. It happened, it cannot be forgotten, and it cannot be repeated with anyone. The second is that anybody can rebuild their life. Even when tragic things happen, you can overcome tragedy and create a good life."
So Jim and I also noticed that there were many, as one would expect, crossovers and similarities. And so we are next showing you a piece that Jim will again read some portions of, that again speaks of the importance of a father and the role of the father in this, in Gabriel Dute's life.
And, photographs are probably the lightest, most succinct thing that you can take with you. They don't take up much room, but they tell amazing, important stories. But Gabriel wrote, "My name is Gabriel Dute. I took this picture of my father and I in Juba, Republic of South Sudan, in the year 2007. He was my hero and role model in life. I only spent a very short time at home with my father and mother and son, but were separated by the civil war in Sudan, which forced me to leave my village at a very young age of 7 years old. For the next 20 years, I lived in various refugee camps in East Africa. When I became a citizen of the United States in 2007, my first priority was to go and visit my parents. The words of advice that my dad told me were unforgettable. He told me to be a good man and treat others with dignity and respect. Told me to get married and find a wife. This ended up being the last time I saw my dad. Life is what it is. I now have children of my own. I hope my 2 boys have some of the good qualities of my dad. There are no words that can describe the love between parents and their children. It is a universal language that everyone feels. I love you, Dad."
This is a Holocaust survivor and her sister, and I'll read a bit since I've just had Jim reading. "My name is Sal Lewis, and I am the person pictured on the right side of this photograph, taken in 1946. My sister, Dora Winarts, is pictured on the left. No person was more responsible for my surviving the Holocaust than my sister. She became the mother I lost throughout the remainder of my life." And I'll let Jim speak to this piece.
Okay. This is a train set that Ralph Reback was given when he was in Germany before they left for the US. And I'm going to read what he wrote, part of what he wrote. "My father purchased this wonderful Marklin electric train set for me to take with us to America. It was a great toy, which was always loved by me, my children, and my grandchildren through these many years. 80 years have gone by after the train left Germany with our family. We were saved by cousins in Chicago who sponsored our ability to enter the US. This was the only way German Jews like us and our train were able to escape the Nazis and find a new home and life in the United States of America." And when I photographed this object. And I did all this work in the basement of the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and I was given a room to work. And I spread out a big piece of seamless white backdrop to do all the photography. And a box of train parts were brought to me on a cart. And so I put the train together. I was a kid. I had an electric train when I was a kid, and I expected that it was pretty simple. And so I did a beautiful, well-lit, organized photograph and printed it. And then we gave it back to Ralph, and he looked at it and he said, "This is all wrong." And so I ended up coming back to Chicago, and we did it a second time, but this time Ralph was there to help me put it together. And so as we were assembling the train and he was telling me about each part and why it needed to go where, somebody walked by and said, "You guys look like two little boys on the floor playing with your electric train." And, Ralph is a little bit older than me, but we're not little boys anymore. But it was just a real sweet moment after photographing so many heavy, heartbreaking things to be able to kind of play. So it was a real nice experience for me.
And as you can see, many participants wrote directly on the print, but there was a variety of responses to the project. So we're going to go through some of those. So here, Andrew Warnes, who's the grandson of Edgar Arndt, created a graphic novel of his grandfather's escape from Europe. Below Jim's photograph that he had taken of the family keys to the house in France that they, of course, never could go back to. The respondent, Andrew, he actually cut Jim's photograph. So the large scale photograph, he cut out the keys, attached them to a backing board, and then put this graphic narrative of his grandfather's story on that backing board. Here in the center, the original object that was photographed was a wedding announcement of Carl, later Charles Lowy, and Sally Queeston. And so this was their wedding announcement. This was, Carl was from Europe. He escaped the Holocaust and had relatives who lived in Chicago. Sally was a Chicagoan and met a relative of Carl's, and they said, basically, "We've got a guy for you if you want to go down to the Dominican Republic." And 2 weeks after they met in the Dominican Republic, they were married. So the response that we get here from the family are the handprints of all of the great grandchildren that came out of this marriage. And here we have a photograph of a survivor or a child of two survivors who was born in a DP camp in Europe. And when we presented her with Jim's photograph of her photograph, she said, no, I look, it's too cute. And I'm a cute little baby. And it was such a difficult time period. And what my family went through was so difficult. So her reaction was to do this. She really wanted to make sure that all of her family members, her parents and she herself were covered. So she typed that up. Some people were very conscious of having their own handwriting on the prints. They didn't, Jim and I would hear comments like, "I don't want to mess it up." Well, in this case, because of how different this response is, she used both stamping and gluing, and it really became a layered crafting project. And that was real wire that she put on top of the print. We received back the artwork, and I was hugely concerned that Jim wasn't going to like this, that it was done wrong. How was I going to tell the survivor that they had done what they were supposed to do? But before any of that, I, of course, went to Jim and I said, "Here's what one of the survivors came back with." And Jim, from my worry that everything had been done wrong, Jim.
And when Arielle sent me the email with a snapshot of this, I just thought, this is so beautiful and it's so amazing. And I love it. I love it when people color outside the lines. And these projects that I've been working on, when anybody does anything other than just write. I just love that sense of that expression. And, you know, when I saw this, I thought, well, this is tells the story so well. It's perfect and has to be in the show.
So also within the exhibition, we see similar objects. Here is a set of dominoes from a Holocaust survivor. Her parents, they were in hiding, but the mother and daughter passed as Catholics publicly, and she went to Catholic school. So her parents gave her this set of dominoes that was from St. Nicholas, so that she could, and I'll read a quote from her photograph. "I was attending a Catholic school under a false name. My parents wanted to be sure that I, like the other children, had received a gift from St. Nicholas, who, by the way, wrote his name on the outside of the box, together with mine." And here we see another set of dominoes. Jim, I'll hand it over to you.
This is Othman Ali's domino set that is a Chicago Iraqi refugee. And when he was leaving Baghdad, his friends got together to wish him goodbye and good luck. And they gave him this domino set. And this is the domino set that they all played with all of their young lives. And they said, we want you to have this, remember all the good times we had, and remember us. And so this is one of the things that I love, as Arielle said, how, you know, it kind of expresses our commonality. And the fact that the Holocaust survivor had dominoes, and then this Iraqi refugee had dominoes, and I photographed teddy bears, and then one Iraqi young girl had Barbie dolls. And I just love that, you know, what this tells us, half of American young girls had Barbie dolls. And when we think of stereotypes and then we see something that is so common, I think it, you know, shares our common humanity, and it also helps us to kind of turn off that othering program that's in our head. So I love when there's objects that are maybe objects that we might ourselves bring.
And I should also say that that Othman is really, he's really an incredible individual. And I feel like so many of the immigrants and refugees that are included in this project, all, you know, most, and I think this is true of a lot of Holocaust survivors, they're very patriotic. They're very thankful for this country. And in this case, Othman was trained as a physics professor, but he got help when he arrived in Chicago from the Iraqi Mutual Aid Society. And as opposed to trying to get himself recertified as a teacher, he actually has become a case manager at IMAS. It was so invaluable to him what the community did when he came here that he now is doing that for others. Another similarity that we have that I've seen in the objects in the exhibition are items that involve food culture. As Ara explained in the beginning of the program, genocide does not only take away people, its intent is to take away all of culture, and that includes food culture. So here we have a recipe book from a European survivor of the Holocaust who moved to the Milwaukee area. This was her cookbook that she, as a young woman, was keeping of family recipes of her grandmother. And yet when she came to this country, she closed this book and didn't really cook from it again. So that food culture was now missing from being transmitted down to the next generation. And here I'm going to give you a little bit of background on this survivor. Mirasod Kausivic was a survivor from the Bosnian Wars. On July 20th, 1992, Mirasod was captured by Serb forces and was sent first to a Marska concentration camp and then a second camp named Majanka. After the Mayanka camp was closed under pressure from the UN, Mirasod spent 6 months in Croatia until he was able to immigrate to the US and settle in Chicago. Both of his brothers were killed in the war. One is still missing. And I'm going to read to you what Mirasod wrote. Things I managed to save from the camp: writing recipes, learning German, cigar holder. For writing, we used aluminum foil and wrappings from cigarette boxes, which we received every second week from the Red Cross. When we didn't have scheduled work detail, we tried to occupy our minds as we whiled away the time inside the barn. Someone came up with the idea to use paper from cigarette boxes to write culinary recipes. Writing recipes of various dishes, we tried to fool our psyche and our hungry stomachs. While doing so, we imagined eating this food. And in conversation with Mirasod, he will actually tell one that in this concentration camp in Bosnia, this idea actually emanated from the fact that they had heard that Holocaust survivors or people that were prisoners at Auschwitz had done the same thing. Maybe not writing it down, but they had talked about recipes. They had recited recipes to each other when they were the most hungry, to kind of imagine that they could be eating that food. And then Mirasod, you'll see that there are a number of people in the show that do get multiple objects and multiple photographs. Mirasod is one of those individuals because we really couldn't not include this other collection of objects. And what this is, they are playing cards that were made out of the boxes that were given to the prisoners from the Red Cross. So these were hand cut, Mirasod says, with a piece of glass, and then they were drawn on the fine line, the numbers, and also the suits. And Mirasod details it on the print itself. We would use whatever we could to create distractions from our current situation. An empty box of crackers became a chessboard or a deck of playing cards. Anything to help pass the time. Of course, all this had to be done secretly. Nevertheless, this has helped us to draw attention, at least for short moments, from our cruel reality. And Jim, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. This is Kasim Hamo's airline tickets. And he's a Yazidi survivor who lives in Lincoln, Nebraska. And the Yazidis experienced a terrible genocide, an ongoing genocide in northern Iraq on Mount Sinjar. And now there's 3,000 Yazidis living in Lincoln, Nebraska. And he wrote, "This is my ticket from when I traveled from Iraq to the United States of America on July 4th, 2012. I have kept this ticket in my wallet for the past 6 years because it reminds me of when I left my country. I stayed one day in Jordan, and then the second day I went to New York and then to Chicago and finally to Nebraska. Now I study biochemistry and pre-pharmacy at UNL, and I will graduate in 2018. And so when you think of what people might take, sometimes they only have their plane tickets and maybe the clothes on their back. And so, and I did mistake, he left before the genocide. Arielle, you have something to say about the 4th of July, don't you?
Yes. So there is this interesting theme. Not only, as I mentioned, are many of these participants so very patriotic, but it just so happens that his flight out to eventually come to this country was on July 4th, as Jim read earlier. Ralph Raybach, the train set, he actually did his writing on the photograph. It happened to be also on July 4th, but I think that it's a nice connection throughout a number of the objects in the show that we see July 4th or this patriotism coming through. To be mindful of the time, I'm gonna move us ahead a little bit. Jim has mentioned about this object, or I guess you can say that it's a phone. And why a phone?
And your phone is probably one of your most important objects, and it has all of your contacts and all of that information. You can communicate, you can text with your family. This is DR, he's a Yazidi, and I probably have a half a dozen or more phones that people brought with them. And this is one of the last pictures he took at Mount Sinjar at Lalish Temple, which is the center of the Yazidi religion that was blown up by ISIS.
And as Jim mentioned before, there are, of course, these objects of childhood. So he talked about Barbie dolls. Here is a teddy bear that was buried in the backyard in Bremen, Germany, when the family was taken eventually to Theresienstadt and then found after the war. And as I mentioned, there are a number of survivors that have multiple objects, or they're just a few, but one of them has 4 objects in the exhibition. And you can see in the installation photograph behind me that right here over my shoulder is where Immaculate's objects are. They're very much a central focus of the exhibition. Immaculate is a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. And her husband and 2 of her children, both of her girls at 3 and 5, were killed in the genocide. I'm gonna hand it over to Jim to read if you can, and then we'll show one other work of Immaculate.
So Immaculate wrote, "Dear Thaddy," Thaddy is her husband, was her husband. "These photos are remains from your dedication to our family. Do you remember how you came from work, put on your shorts, and played with our children? They loved that time, and you loved taking their photos. When I miss you, when I think of you, when I'm lonely, I look at them and cry. Thank you so much for loving me until your last day. Thank you for leaving behind a legacy of love. You were an exceptional husband, and I love you dearly. To Reza," she was 3, "to Clarice," she was 5. You have been a blessing, and I thank God for the few years you gifted me with your love. I would never imagine myself living without you. Even today, you are a driving force in my life. I want to be able to see you again. Love you so much. Mother, wife, Immaculate Mutanagnera."
And at that central case in the exhibition are 3 textiles. Immaculate was called down to Rwanda when they were doing earthworks in January of 2017. And it was believed that the area that they were in was where this mass grave was that included her children. So she did go down to Rwanda and was able to identify her children based on these pieces of clothing. I think it's also interesting in terms of when we look at the response, not only is this an incredibly touching and difficult story, but she takes, even in the pain of writing and detailing this history, she takes these stickers of roses and fireworks and things that I think she would think her girls would want, and puts them directly on the print. So I think we're not going to read this piece aloud. We'll let you go to the museum and see the objects for yourself and read Immaculate's incredible writings about her family. And here you can actually see Immaculate at the opening of the exhibition. She was very proud to have her items included. And when we've traveled the show, like we have now to your museum, there was concern that maybe because these are such precious objects, we should only travel 1 textile and keep the others in storage. But Immaculate actually was the one who said no to that idea. She believes that her daughters kind of live on by people learning their story. Here is Ralph and his train. We wanted to show you that, of course, behind the objects, behind the photographs of the objects, are these incredible individuals. This is a survivor again of the Bosnian War. Here we see Peter. He is a lost boy from Sudan. He was a child soldier, and this is his beautiful bride. He actually just got married in Sudan before everything that just happened. He went back and they got married in a very traditional and colorful ceremony that seemed to have happened over multiple weeks. Here is one of the family members that came out of this relationship of Carl and Sally. There's Andrew, who created the graphic novel of his grandfather. And this is the totality of Cian Doyen's family. They all came to the opening to see these items that were included for the exhibition. So, and then you can also see some of the other types of items that are in the show. A jacket, a typewriter. And that's our section of the program tonight. So I will stop sharing and I think we'll move on to question and answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Arielle and Jim. I can only say this really enhanced the experience. I saw the exhibit, but that was so impactful, and I just hope that all those that are watching will take the opportunity to experience firsthand what you just shared with us. So thank you so much. That was so inspiring. I think we're going to take a few questions. We don't have that many, but I think I can start out with a couple here. One would be, could you describe the process of selecting which objects would be displayed in this exhibition?
Sure. So Jim's project, the original project, what we carried, where this sort of emanated from, was different, as I mentioned. There, people would bring with them the objects when they were meeting with Jim, or if Jim was in their home, they would, go into the living room and bring, or go into the kitchen and bring into the living room something they had brought with them from Baghdad or Syria. In this case, since we were working with an established collection at our museum, what I wanted to do is, in regards to the items that came from within the Holocaust time period, I wanted to make sure that we had representation of both female and male stories. I wanted to make sure that there was geographical representation, that, how we saw something that was from a survivor who ended up in the Dominican Republic versus somebody like Henry Stone. We just saw his camp jacket. So, and I also wanted to look for a variety of types of objects. There's the vast majority of our collection are documents and photographs. And I think that that's true across the board for Holocaust museums. And Jim and I have talked about this. It's because the way in which you get here, the way you get out of somewhere where there's conflict, and the way in which you get into this country is through having documentation. And yet we wanted to make sure that there was a variety of types of objects shown. So that's where we looked towards a tea set that was bought by a family who escaped to Shanghai, the teddy bear, the baby doll. And then when it came to the objects from the other survivor communities, we basically worked with our colleagues in a number of different agencies here in the Chicago area, and they sort of nominated almost a survivor from their community that they thought might have some objects. As you know, it's very difficult for example, Armenian survivors to have really any objects. We did work with, and we located one person who had a traditional Ottoman wrapper that they kept, that they, I think, brought with them as they were forced to move to Syria. And somebody else had a small Ottoman coin, and that was it, one Ottoman coin. So Jim actually photographed it both on each side, and both sides are included in the photograph that the family responded to. But so that's how we got our objects from the other communities.
Just a reminder to all those watching, please feel free to go ahead and put your questions in the chat or the Q&A. I do have another one. One of them was, at around what year did you begin this project?
So I'm going to hand that to Jim.
Okay. I started the project in Portland in 2010 with Iraqi refugees. I had an exhibition in 2011, and I thought that might be the end of the project. And then I was contacted by an organization in Boston who was having an exhibition about war and the aftermath of war. And they asked me if they could exhibit my What We Carried project that they'd heard about some way. And I said, well, no, I'd like to not use the Portland version, but I'd like to come to Boston and create a new What We Carried project in your community. And so I went to Lynn, Massachusetts, and worked with an organization, and we did an entire exhibit there. And then one thing led to another. Then I ended up working with the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn, and then they started having bigger exhibitions. And then we had a show at the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and it just kind of grew by whatever means, word of mouth, internet, and all that. And so once we started Stories of Survival, that started a whole new kind of look at how this project works. And one of the things I love about this project, it's not about me, it's about the participants. They write their own stories, it's in their own hand. And not only are these stories important for us to hear, but it also gives the participants agency. They are telling their stories, and many of the participants have wanted to tell their stories. And I've had Iraqi refugees tell me that I'm the first American that's given them the time of day. And so for them to thank me for that, being able to tell their stories, it just tells me that this project is working, and it needs to continue.
Thank you very much for that answer. Actually, another of our participants would like to share that they want to share that your care and loving work are clearly seen and experienced in these deeply moving objects and stories, which is just what you've shared with us this evening. So thank you.
Thank you.
Another question was, do you plan to continue looking for survivors and sharing their stories?
I am. I mean, since Stories of Survival, I've done several projects with the Immigrant Story, which is an organization in Portland. And we did a project with DACA people. And so it's about, the DACA issue. And we also did a project called I Am My Story with African women survivors of genocide. And right now we're working on a project with the Portland Jewish Museum, which is similar but much smaller than Stories of Survival, and we only have 12 stories, but it's a little different in that it has some of the objects, but it has big portraits of the participants, and then my What We Carried, and so they're all 2 feet by 3 feet. But we do have a big Rohingya community in Portland, so that's a project that I was going to start last year, but COVID interrupted that. And now that Afghanis are coming to Portland, I'll do a project once they have time to settle and feel comfortable. So this project has a life of its own, and I'm happy to tag along with it.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. There's another question coming in here. Let me, do you know him? Let's see, what has been your experience watching students view this exhibit?
Arielle, do you want to take that?
I actually would, I'm gonna give it back to you.
Okay. It's been great. And I've been, traveling the show to universities, and, I love when I'm asked to do a show and of these projects. And often I'm asked, do you want to have the exhibit in the University Art Museum, or maybe the art department gallery? And my answer is always, do you have a cafeteria? do you have a student commons? Because I want the work to be seen, and not everybody goes to the University Art Museum. And so the response has always been so human. And the projects create so much interest and compassion and empathy. And every time I talk to students, I say, anybody can do this. You could do it going home to your grandparents and ask them what they have, because they probably came from someplace or something was handed down to them. You don't have to take it with a fancy camera and fancy lighting. You can do it with your phone. You can lay an object on a copier and give it to somebody and have them write their story. And so for me, it's a way to engage students and maybe get them to start thinking about telling their own family story.
And I think in an answer to maybe school-age children, this was enormously popular with our docent corps and with the student groups that came here. And although I have the title of Chief Curator, I think that what the students liked the most was hearing not from a curator, but hearing from either the family members or the survivors themselves in their words, describing their story. And another thing that I think was interesting both for students and for general visitors is there's very little labeling that it goes next to the photographs, and that's very intentional. I asked, and people asked me, they said, oh, handwriting, it's going to be hard, people won't be able to read it, everybody writes differently. But that's actually very much part of Jim's intention, is to have very little labeling and have the visitors push to engage directly with the photographs. The photographs are large scale, so you can easily, depending on the handwriting, read the text of the survivor or their descendant. And that, again, was I think something that really pulled not only student visitors, but pulls visitors in, is just looking at handwriting is something different. We don't see that all the time. And in fact, now we see handwriting very little. So it's a really special thing to read about someone's story and with this handwritten script.
And one thing I'd like also to say, I love when I drive by the Illinois Holocaust Museum or the Maltz Museum, and I see all those yellow school buses. And I mean, to me, that says, these are the people that need to see the shows. And so it just always makes me feel very optimistic and hopeful.
Well, I love the way you bring the audience, you bring the work to the audience, especially students. That's a great point. This will be the last question. I do want to just say that what you're doing is personalizing these events that people maybe read about in history, and it's so important. What do you want the audience to take away from your exhibition when they come and see it? What do you hope they take away?
Jim.
Well, I hope they share our common humanity. And I really do hope people put themselves in the shoes of the storytellers here. And, I see this as a call to action. I really want people to feel like this is not just history. It's important history and it needs to be preserved. But, these events continue to happen. And, there's those 8 steps to genocide. And often when we hear about those or read about those, we think, well, of course, we're not going to see Holocaust. But every insidious step towards genocide, othering, presidential candidates who call people rapists and murderers, all of those steps are ways to other. And if only step 1, 2, and 3 happen, those are still really bad things. And so we have to think about just how these processes are so easy and so quiet, and pretty soon they grow. And so for me, it's, we need to understand that.
Absolutely. We hope you don't have to add any more events to your work. That would be a wonderful goal. I thank you so much for answering those questions and for sharing that. I'm going to turn it back over to Dahlia Fisher to close out the evening. Dahlia?
Thank you. What a great night. Thank you, Ara, Arielle, and Jim. And thank you to our program partners and our exhibition sponsors for making this possible. We are always learning. From yesterday to today, can indeed build a better future. And Ara, cheers to what you just said. Let us not have to see any more of the horrors that we've been exploring tonight into our future. We hope that everyone that's joined us on this exhibit launch event will also join us in person at the museum for our celebratory $5 week now through October 31st. And if you can't make it into the museum, please register for one of our virtual tours featuring Arielle and Jim. The exhibition is open until February 27th. So we thank you so much for joining us, and good night. See you soon.